You can try to quench plurality and enforce an authoritarian system in which everybody thinks the same and speaks the same and all agree, but that does not bring freedom. And humankind, we really want our freedom. So to be one of those who speak up for freedom today, I do find to be a bit of a Viking attitude. So maybe you're talking to a Viking lady right now.
Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussein, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Hello, welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. Today, my guest is Hanne Nabintu Herland. Hanne is the author of the newly released book, New Left Tyranny, which she adds to her list of 9 other books written in Norwegian and English, including Alarm, Reflections on a Culture in Crisis, and an autobiography, Respect, published in 2012. Hanne is a Scandinavian historian of comparative religions, a best-selling author, columnist, and TV producer, known from media for her sharp analysis and her fearless speech. She was born and raised in Africa and has lived in South America, the Middle East, and traveled extensively in Asia. She's the founder of the Herland Report website and YouTube channel, which has been read and viewed by millions. Welcome, Hanne.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be on your show.
It's a real pleasure to have you. We've been looking forward to this for a long time, haven't we?
Yeah. Yes, we sure have. And all the way from Trinidad, it's really an honor to be with you.
Thanks. Now, you are in Norway right now, correct?
No, actually, I am in the UK.
Okay, all right. But you were recently traveling?
Yes, this is true. I live in Norway, so I have been recently traveling there. Yes. So.
Okay. What's that like now with the lockdowns and this COVID-19 situation? Just give us an idea.
Well, I think all over the world, the anticipation or the what was expected was really that this would be a pandemic or a plague, in the sense that millions would die. And having looked at the meeting that the WHO leader, Dr. Tedros, had with the European leaders March 10th, he clearly stated to them that millions would die. Apparently, Angela Merkel in Germany was so afraid that people had to call, other state leaders had to calm her down. And 2 days later, most of Europe was closed down. Later, it has turned out to be it is a pandemic, but it has not claimed millions of lives. So I think that considering the assessment that very many would die, this is partly the reason why they closed down the economies in Europe. And now it's time to reopen and maybe understand that it wasn't as bad as they expected.
Right. Now, you have a fascinating story, and I really feel connected to it. When I saw your website and channel for the first time, I was amazed at your guests and your perspective. what if I was to try to summarize it, it seems to me that you're really trying to figure out what's going on with the world and the way out of all the cultural, economic, and spiritual problems that we're all facing. Would you say that's an accurate summary?
Yes, I would say that. And I think that my upbringing, I'm born and raised in Africa, in Central Africa, and I grew up in East Africa as well. And when I first moved to Europe, I was 19 years old. I had spent some time in Norway and in Belgium and Europe. But when I moved, I was really shocked at the very different perspectives and views of life and views of the world that those two continents had. So up to this point, really, it's been a great interest of mine to attempt to be able to help people from one culture understand another culture better, so that we can avoid all these conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally understand. I mean, I actually was raised in Canada, in Toronto. And my parents were immigrants. I was actually born in the States. And so, I've had this, always between different worlds. And I, in fact, left when I was 20 to come down to the Caribbean to live permanently. But I maintained my links I did my PhD in the UK. And I understand exactly what you mean by trying to bridge these different worlds to get a truly global perspective. Because, a lot of times what is portrayed as a global perspective up in, the States or Europe or Canada is not truly a global perspective. It really doesn't filter in. And this is why one of the things I'm interested in is your time in Africa. So you were born in the Congo, and you spent a lot of time in East Africa, I believe Kenya and Rwanda, if I'm not mistaken. And your parents worked with UNESCO. I know among the expat communities in a lot of countries in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, it's like either UNESCO, or it's a diplomat community, or it's the multinationals or missionaries. Those are like the big, or sometimes universities. Those are a lot of the reasons why you find people from Europe and elsewhere in these countries for extended periods. So when you grew up in Africa, what was your experience like? Because you were in those development circles, weren't you? Those diplomatic development government circles.
I would actually argue that my parents were all of the above, all that you mentioned, really.
Right.
They first worked with UNESCO, then they helped found faculties at the universities there. My father was a mathematician and a physicist. And later on, they moved into missionary work. They also did a lot of building. They also had their own airplane company for a number of years. So I was lucky because my parents were very, one may say, liberal, in the sense that they were open towards all people from all walks of life.
Yeah.
So I grew up with Indians, for example. My father was a very good friend with the wealthy Indians in Congo.
Yeah. Actually,
so,
what years were you there?
I was a bridesmaid when I was, excuse me?
The years were like what, the 60s and 70s?
This is the 70s and the 80s.
And 80s.
So
you had Idi Amin, you had the expulsion of the Indians from Kenya at the time and so forth. You were living through that, were you?
I was living through that. And you may say my guardian in Kenya was a man that used to be very close to Idi Amin, but he broke off from his, they ruled the country together. He saw things went sour. He broke off. He was a general. He broke off from Idi Amin. And I grew up in his house in Kenya with a lot of the UN soldiers guarding him, because Idi Amin wanted to kill him. He was later knighted by Queen Elizabeth in the UK because he saved very many people from a certain death.
What was his
from
name?
Idi Amin. So these are just some stories from my childhood.
What was his name?
His name was Begary,
Right.
Sir John Begary.
Yeah. You know, Museveni in Uganda, I think he's a remarkable man. I have a lot of respect for him. And did you ever have contact with him at all?
Well, interesting you mentioned Uganda. I'm quite often in Uganda. I'm very good friends with the daughter of Begary. And Museveni was actually picked by the group around Begary to become president or to go for elections in Uganda. And I think he's brought peace to Uganda and has quite a number of strong opinions pertaining to what you were saying too, that often in the world community has decided is really France, UK, and America that has decided. And many African leaders are annoyed by that, saying they would like to have more autonomy from a number of the economic bondage, you may say, that Africa still has to some of those colonial powers, one may say. But of course, it's a question of money, and whoever has the strongest force will attempt to rule the world. And it's been that way since the beginning of time. So that is nothing new. It was this way during the Babylonians and the Egyptians. And whoever has the biggest army, I guess, will also own the economy. So there's a lot of things to talk about pertaining to that.
Yeah, definitely. Now, as part of your story, I found it, you have some interesting phrases that intrigue me that I'd like to explore. Like, for instance, when you said you had this massive culture shock when you returned to Europe at 19 years old, and you specified the stigmas about Africa, and you understood that Europeans were brainwashed. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, that really pulled me into the work that I'm doing as a historian of comparative religions and author, and having worked for many years in the cultural fields. Coming from Africa, I had grown up with Muslims and Indians and all kinds of people, and I was not afraid of Muslims. When I came to Europe and first moved there, I saw that many were, and understandably enough, as well as very many were not used to foreigners, you may say, or non-Western foreigners at all. And it's a natural thing for us that we can be afraid of people that we do not know or do not understand. So at any rate, I decided to go to the university and start studying cultural studies, hoping that I could be able to bridge some of that a negative gap between, you may say, races or the newly arrived non-Western immigrants and things like that. And what was particular for me was to see, I came from Kenya, and this was at the time of Daniel Arap Moi was the president in Kenya. And Kenya was a very well-run government and country. People came from all over Africa to go to Kenya to experience lovely things, go for vacation and get merchandise. But when I came to Norway and Europe, everybody said that Moi, and you remember this was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
So the so-called dictators in Africa were not needed anymore in the Cold War. So within 1 year, they went from being lovely people that, were allied with the West to being demonized in every possible way, saying so-and-so is a dictator, the other one is a dictator. We've seen the same happen recently in both Syria and Libya with Gaddafi. Suddenly he's a dictator. The year before, George Bush said he was a wonderful guy who had adopted to the West. And Condoleezza Rice, remember all of that. He was greatly greeted by Bush. The next year, he was a dictator. So it was the same situation back then. So then I understood that there's something, and this is, many years ago, I understood that the mainstream media has a power to tell people who's bad and who's good and who is good in Europe. And that doesn't correspond with the reality on the ground in those nations. And that shocked me.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's really amazing how, someone could be your best friend one day, like Saddam Hussein, and then be the worst evil dictator the next. And then Saudi Arabia could be your best friend, while Iran is demonized as the worst enemy. But, really, Iran in so many ways is more progressive than Saudi Arabia. It's this tremendous media manipulation that, as you say, I mean, witnessing it myself in going to various countries where leaders have been demonized, and you see that the situation is so different, and that is, it's all politically motivated. And well, this is interesting because then it takes us to the media, because you were a prominent media commentator and personality in Norway and perhaps wider Scandinavia. You can elaborate on that. And yet after a time, you moved away to start your own media house. And one thing you noted was that, you got tired of the media always misquoting you, and you understood that that was actually their aim. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, and that takes me into the topic of my new book, The New Left Tyranny, because what I understood when I first came to Europe was that traditional values, Christian values, religious values, historic values were scorned. To my surprise, coming from a very turbulent Congo and coming from a military dictatorship in which people were basically killed or removed or whatever you call it, if they said something that opposed the system at the time, coming to Europe and understanding or having an understanding of the stability in Europe, the well-functioning, infrastructure, university systems. People came from all over the world to study in these European countries, and they still do to the UK and other places. And many of those civilized or civilizational values that built the West, such as the foundation of the family, equal rights, rights of women, the right to private property ownership. You could be certain that when you bought a house, it would remain yours. Not some minister wouldn't, or some leader in a nation wouldn't come and just expropriate your land. You were certain that this was well-functioning institutions, these things, values, the 10 commandments, I would say. Try not to lie, try not to steal. There's a lot of stability in a nation that is founded on these values. And to my surprise at the university, I found that these values were scorned, and I got to understand there's a word called neo-Marxism, which came out of the philosophers in Germany post-World War II. They were neo-Marxists, and they were the founding fathers of the 60s movement. And they went to America, and this came to become the hippie movement. And the hippie movement is very central, because the hippie movement defined the uproar against traditional values in the West. And I do believe that this uproar has been very misguided, and it has led to the lack of stability that we do see today. If you go back in history and you look at the Roman Empire, for example, certain values, discipline, civility, respect for one another, respect for differences, politeness, a strong army, many of these values were founding values as the Roman Empire grew. But at the height of its power, they changed the values. They kept their sons in Rome for the big parties and didn't send them to the army anymore. It wasn't so important anymore whether you were a hedonist or forget about the family. Let's just, indulge in whatever we want to feel like doing, no personal responsibility. So there you see how a society begins to fall apart. And I guess that was my experience. I began to understand that quite early, coming into the Norwegian and the European segment, that Europe was in a very particular rebellion, and a Marxist rebellion. That is how I understood it at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting, because for me, 'cause I like to sort of compare our experiences and have you comment on it. At the age of 19, I was very radically left. I had been involved in all sorts of different movements, whether it be socialist or anarchist, and then I had got into black nationalist movement. So, and the education I received in Toronto was so liberal. I mean, we had no real exposure to conservative thought. The whole idea was that conservatives were stupid. They were the people who watched sports, who were selfish, who were greedy, who didn't know anything about the world. And once you were educated and concerned about, the famine in Ethiopia or Amnesty International or all these worldly justice things, that was left wing, and that was, and that the old 1950s order that was valorized was a racist order, was an imperialist order that subjugated the rest of the world, and also minorities and women and others, in the West. And so I was very much socialized into that sort of rebellious nature against the entire system, and wanted it to be overthrown for freedom's sake. And I sort of had my awakening and criticism sort of took on different lines, but let's say, had we met in those days and I was on that side and you were on the other side, what do you think you would say to someone like myself who would have really believed that all that stuff was repressive, all that Christian politeness, and that was repressive towards non-whites, towards minorities? It was part of imperialism. How would you, coming from Africa, you would have had a different perspective. How would you make that argument against a standard liberal one?
Well, the strange thing too was that in Africa, people were very conservative, in the sense they had, the respect for the elderly, for example, was very important. I found none of that, or little of that, coming to Europe, which shocked me too. The respect for, and this is something many find strange that I say. I would argue that the Muslim communities have had a high respect for women. I didn't understand why. Where does that come from? That just because somebody wears a veil, that woman is automatically somebody's slave? Where do they get it from? African women were very strong. And coming to Europe, they assumed that all of them were the man's slave. I don't even know African women, and I have a lot of African friends up to this day. I don't know African women that are very weak. I know many more European women that are weak. So I would have told you at that time, I would have said that obviously there were mistakes in the old bourgeoisie, to speak with, from the Marx angle. There were hypocrisies happening in the Christian environments, for sure. It's a sad time when the priest, kicks out a young girl who maybe had a child out of wedlock, for example. I don't even know how much in the how much that really is a religious issue, or whether it is simply cultural that they did that. Because we see something very different if we read the founder of the Christian religion, Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
We see that he was the one that forgave and helped people rather. But I mean, there were misguided hypocrites. There have been bishops and priests that have done very many strange things. But I would have argued with you saying, be careful with our cultures so we don't throw away all the good values that were in the traditional setting of the Western civilization. Let's reform only that which is not working. Let's not throw overboard everything that is working. And that is what I kind of find that the liberals have done. They have become so engaged in throwing overboard everything. The world is supposed to be now, women are supposed to rule the man, and we are supposed to kill the males, like Milo Yiannopoulos puts it. Of course, that's an exaggeration.
Yeah.
But we see a feminism that in the Marxist segment from the 1970s onward has started war between the sexes, which has led to enormous amount of divorce and lack of understanding, and a warring attitude between us that I think is not profitable. So some moderation, I probably would have argued if I would have met you back then.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I really think, upon reflection, that it really came, you know what they call first world problems, that it's pampered middle class people who don't know, who take so many things for granted, who take for granted that electricity and water are just there all the time, who take for granted that the law, the police, roads, infrastructure just work. They, and that if you defund the police, like Antifa is saying, or if you have, no laws, like, anarchists might say, or that the world would be functioning perfectly, because they have not lived in situations where these things do not function. They don't understand, what it takes to just get the basics of civilization correct. And it's really, I believe it comes from a situation of being spoiled. And as I traveled more and lived in other countries and whatnot, and I just had a very, very different perspective and understanding what it really takes to create and maintain civilization, and that people who who never had to fight for it or understand what it means when it actually does break down, they just take it for granted. And I think that you definitely would have brought that insight coming from Africa, knowing how civilization can easily fall. And it seems like the West is rapidly approaching that in the United States with these riots, and I don't know what it's like. Well, you're in the UK now, so there's some of that there, definitely. But that's quite interesting. Now, I want to just get into a little. If you could just tell me a bit what it was like when you started your own media. So is your Herland report on YouTube and your website. Do you also have a traditional media presence as well? Because your videos are very, very well produced. I can see, you have, multiple cameras and edits and all that sort of stuff. It's not just like what I have here, a little crappy Zoom connection. You have a very well produced show. Can you explain like how it came about, how you left it, and what it is you're doing there?
I was lucky back in 2010, was it? I had a big bestseller, blockbusting bestseller in Scandinavia, and in which I argued, that there's some of the traditional values we should be careful not to let go of because it
What was the
can
title of that book?
cause. The title of that book was Alarm.
Right, the one,
Thoughts of
right.
a Culture in Crisis, and it completely. I had been engaged writing op-eds and stuff like that in the leading media prior to that, but that book caught something. I think I went from TV studio to TV studio, and for a whole year before it ended. I guess I look good on camera, so one of the reasons why the media wanted to have me there was, of course, blonde woman, whatever, and they could mix me in and, add to their audience and stuff. And I probably said things that they didn't expect someone to say. I broke off from some of the feminist thought. They found that extremely shocking, that a woman would have a personal opinion, that she could be independent was extremely shocking, I guess, and they all wanted me in the studios. But after a few years, and I had several bestsellers at that time and kept writing, but after a few years, I started noticing, you're misquoted if you're a conservative, if you say something positive about the man, that the male, the man is a wonderful creature that God created. And, if you voice things like that, you get bashed and demonized. And up to this point, still today, it started to become too much. They quoted me only on a part of what I was talking about and not the whole issue. And after a while, I decided, what, if this is gonna be the way it is, let me start do my own thing. And I have understood later that as Herbert Marcuse, who's considered to be the father of the 1960s student revolution movement in the United States, he speaks about the need to repress those opinions that we do not like.
Yeah.
That is to say, those who belong to the new left, who are neo-Marxists, who are, like you're saying, anarchists or whatever they are. They think society is going to develop in a great way if we impose these kinds of ways of thinking. They imposed from the 60s onward repressive tolerance. That is to say, to shut out and shut off the majority of the Europeans who were Christians, religious people, whatever, who believed in traditional values, and to demean them in such a way that they seemed to be kind of crazy, everything. So due to that, I stopped. Okay, the TV stations called me and called me and called me and called me for a couple years. I told them, no, I have stopped. I don't think the debate is fair. And I started the Herland Report, and it was an instant success. It's the news site. It's the news site, but also the YouTube channel, because since I did a lot of TV, we had spoken to the editors and said, why don't you make shows in which the guest can speak at length? Not only 2 minutes, pro, con, and then everybody's supposed to go to war against each other, and you haven't even had time to explain your view. And there you are, being bashed by somebody, and it's supposed to be like a show. But we didn't succeed in that, so that's what I started doing on my own. And we have millions and millions of views now.
You were like a pioneer, because I don't think long form was a big thing in 2010. Now long form like Joe Rogan and all this stuff is big, but I don't think when you started, you really did sort of pioneer that format, didn't you?
Well, I think when we started the Herland Report, it was later than 2010, but when we started the Herland Report in Europe, very few channels did the same. Mm-hmm. So I have been really all alone doing something that in America, it's normal to do this, and the public debate in the US with Daily Wire and a lot of these shows do stuff like that with Dave Rubin, for example. Yeah. and others, but in Europe we haven't had much of that. So it's been an instant success, and I am now in connection with a lot of the leading intellectuals in the West, and they publish their material on our website. And we also have an array of them that we have spoken to in the TV segment as well. For example, Ron Paul, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, we have Senator Richard Black, we have William Binney, the NSA whistleblower, we have CIA directors and NSA people explaining vital things, leading best-selling authors in the United States, and even people like Lillian Miller from Playboy at the time. We even have her. So we have a wide variety of people that we speak to, and we also have the man who's considered to be the priest or one of the priests that Donald Trump is using, who's an African-American, wonderful man,
Pastor Manning?
Bishop Harry Jackson.
Oh, Jackson, yeah.
And we also invite, for example, clear-cut socialists, African-Americans such as Reginald Davis. And I love Reginald Davis. And he speaks about white supremacy and Darwinism. So, I mean, we have a variety, cross-cultural and very cross-political.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that amazed me about your show was that you had this wide range of people, many of who I also interviewed on my program as well, and that was amazing. It really connected me, because I've also had Bill Binney and Paul Craig Roberts and so forth, and I take people from right and left, and I'd like to ask you, who were some of your personal standouts from? I know it's hard to choose favorites, but who is there anybody that you would say really has stood out in your mind?
Well, I must say that both the socialist preacher, Dr. Reginald Davis, he's like a brother to me. I don't know. I mean, we're really kindred spirits, to put it that way. I would also point out Bishop Harry Jackson. It's been an honor to work with him and also have private conversations with him. I also especially respect Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. We work very closely together, almost daily in touch. Ron Paul, of course, now I'm mentioning some of the same people. And a very big moment for me was actually to speak to Senator Richard Black.
Yeah.
Really a kindred spirit as well. So I think in a free world, we don't live in a free world. I think we're implementing much of the dictatorship and the authoritarianism that we've seen in years past. We're re-implementing that now, both in Europe and in the United States. And I think that the millennial generation, or even the generation before that, even my generation, we haven't seen the world wars, we haven't seen the wars, we haven't seen the desperation, and we seem desperate to get back to that kind of Nazi thinking. And I think that the left wing today is permeated, in my humble view, by a very strong Nazi element, at least here in Europe, where we focus extremely on the color of somebody's skin. And I think that is a very wrong path to go down. I don't think ever that the skin color of a person was able to define whether that person was good or bad. But this is what we saw in the Nazi ideology, was the feeling that whoever had a certain skin color was to be eradicated. So we're returning to a very dark and sad part of European history. And in the right wing, you see kind of like somewhat the same attitude, but it's displayed in another way. It's displayed in such a way that Europeans, for example, let me stick to that, will say, let's get rid of all the foreigners and then life will be wonderful here in Europe. Again, thinking if we are all white-skinned here, then life will be beautiful. So there's this sense, this ideology that I think is reflected both on the left wing and in the right wing, that is negative. And in the left, you also see it in the sense that, oh, we must feel sorry for everybody who has another skin color. Oh, poor them. They probably cannot do anything, can they? So let's give them benefits. And to me, it's been very strange because most of the foreigners that come to Europe from Africa are the rich people in Africa. Those are the only ones that have the money to take that trip on the lovely flights and pay pay to come to Europe. And many of them speak a multilingual, highly educated. But then the left says, oh, poor you. So you come from Africa, poor you. Let's not be harsh. Let's not apply equality for you. So I've always spoken about equality disregarding whichever race, personal responsibility disregarding the color of your skin. But I see that my points are not exactly popular probably in Europe at the moment. So I would argue that I see much of the same Nazi kind of feeling coming up stronger and stronger, both on the left and on the right side in European politics.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff that I want to pick apart and explore a little more. But one thing I'd like to ask you, because I'm interested in the different national contexts. So, you've interviewed some pretty controversial people, and some people, well, controversial in the mainstream sense as it now is in America and the UK. I don't think they're controversial but Milo Yiannopoulos has been banned from Facebook, and whatnot. Now you faced that in Norway? Is it as bad as it is in the UK and in the United States?
Yeah, yes, it is very bad. Back in 2017, prior, I think it was August, September, around there back in 2017, when Facebook started really implementing their censorship structures. Prior to that, we had like thousands of likes per post. We had hundreds of comments. I think one of our posts had as much as 24,000 likes. So it was immense popularity around when I spoke of such things as equality. Let's apply equality for everyone. But then Facebook started the censorship, and our pages went from having like I was saying, high numbers of followers to 34 likes, 24 likes, 2 comments. So I started asking around in Europe because I was collaborating with Germans and other people at the time. And they said, no, this is what's been happening all around. So I think that one of the negative issues for the neo-Marxist left, starting off in the 60s and now completing their project 50 years later, is that the authoritarian element in it, the complete lack of respect for diversity. Look, God himself made this world a very diverse place. It's supposed to be wonderful that we have different skin colors, hair colors, that there are colors in this world is supposed to be something we embrace and love. But we do see in this kind of new left tyranny, my book again, available on Amazon, let me mention that. But we do see a lack of respect for diversity that is implemented through Facebook, Twitter, and our Twitter account is almost shut down. I mean, we have, let's say, 100 more followers, and then they cut them.
Yeah.
But then again, what to say? I think that among the people, there's a rising awareness now, and I see it in Norway, I see it in the UK. There's a strong rising awareness that people are very weary of this censorship. and they feel faint-hearted, saying, what can we do? Because we're not allowed to be Europeans anymore. We're not allowed to have diversity of opinion. So I think there will be a backlash, just like we see the backlash in the United States against these horrible riots that destroy everything. I expect people will vote for Trump more than ever due to these out of control Black Lives Matter issues now that don't help Black lives either.
That's
To put
right.
it that way.
Yeah. It's yeah, I mean, I had the same experience. My YouTube videos were getting like 30,000 views, 20,000 views, and yeah, then all of a sudden they just, they had banned me for a little while. Then I appealed and they put it back up, but it's been low after. But I've gotten on other channels. People have invited me on, and so whatever happens on these platforms, you will definitely survive. I will survive, and we'll get our message out there, because it's the truth, and the truth will prevail. I think you have to have that spiritual core to believe that the truth is good, and people want good, and that it will prevail. It's this long battle of good and evil in that sense, and I think that that has been a center of your being, as and then your channel as well. And I think that's important because these are personal challenges that we face as well. It's not just intellectual media work. I mean, it's really personal. But there's so many things that I wanted to follow up on, and I'm going to go a little bit off track here, but it's something I've always thought about, and I think you'd provide an excellent insight. You were talking about in the media how in Scandinavia they liked your presence, blonde hair, woman, etc. And and you were also talking about the tremendous left-wing liberal bias. I've always wondered, and again, this is an off topic, but I really want to hear your opinion. You live in the land of the Vikings. You are the descendant of the Vikings, the raping and pillaging hordes, and and contemporary Scandinavians seem so meek and liberal, and it just seems the total opposite of the Vikings. What have you ever reflected on that? I'd love to hear your insights about that. What was it? Was it Christianity? Was it, I don't know. What is it?
Very interesting question, to be honest. And actually, at the Herland Report YouTube, we do have an upcoming TV series now in which I speak to experts about the Viking Age.
Right.
So we're gonna air that show in English in just a few days. So funny you should mention that. But I do think that the Viking times, for Norway, to put it that way, we from the 1200s, 1300s, we were a part of Denmark. And we became like a province of Denmark for 400 or 500 years. I think that there was something that happened there that has kind of quenched the spirit. I don't think that you will find the quenching of the Viking spirit from the time when Norway, let me stick to Norway, became a nation state, because that was quite early on, and we had our height, our most mighty period as unifying the whole of the Nordic countries post becoming Christians. And the Christianity actually, this is something that the neo-Marxists, of course, are not teaching at the universities in the United States and in Europe today, but because they say that everything fell apart once Christianity came. That is not true. That was when we started having the marriage. That's when it was not allowed anymore to take and kill the children. We kind of found an order, and the nation was assembled in one, I mean, the different tribes were assembled in one nation at that time, which caused and created a structure that we built our nation on as well. But it is a good question. Of course, nobody wants to go back to the raping and the plundering. So that's for sure. But we do want to have a strong population and a strength among ourselves, so that we stand up for those values that we do believe in, and in the perspective of persecution and being ridiculed and all of this that we see so strongly now in the kind of dictatorial new left system that we live under. We should be fine with that. I mean, so many have been persecuted before us. If our names are slandered and we use some followers on YouTube, who cares? The truth is still the truth. And I do believe we have God on our side, in the sense that we are created differently, and plurality is a wonderful thing. You can try to quench plurality and enforce an authoritarian system in which everybody thinks the same and speaks the same and all agree, but that does not bring freedom. And humankind, we really want our freedom. So to be one of those who speak up for freedom today, I do find to be a bit of a Viking attitude. So maybe you're talking to a Viking lady right now.
Absolutely. You are a fighter. I suppose here's another question I'd like to ask you about too, and your views. I was raised, let me tell you, I was raised a Catholic. I left the church around, like, when I was a teenager, mid-late teens. And then later on, I actually, I was an atheist. And then later on, I embraced Hinduism. And I mean, I am, a profound theist now. But I understand the atheist argument and the mentality and how you get trapped in it. And so I have some sympathy towards it. What I'm interested from your perspective, I still have a lot of respect for the Catholic Church. I have, a healthy respect for E. Michael Jones, for example. We have very good conversations. But one thing that I need to speak to Dr. Jones more in depth about, because we speak on a lot of different topics, but I do agree with his logos and whatnot, but I think that logos has expressed itself in many other cultures and contexts. And he is certainly of the view that it is the Christian tradition and Jesus, and that is the expression of logos, and all others are anti-logos. So with your understanding of Christianity and how it inspires you and the Bible, I have total respect for that. But I'd like to hear your view about, Hindus, about other religions. Many Christians would say, we are, extreme Christian would say, well, we're idol worshippers, we're devil worshippers, etc. Other people might say, okay, we believe different things. You may not actually believe, maybe you'll come to Jesus in your own way or whatever. So there's a kind of patient conversionism. There are other people that say, listen, not everybody has to become Christian. So I'd like to hear your views on that, and then how that relates to, the development and redemption of the world, because eschatology is something very, very important in a lot of Christian thought. So I'd just like to hear your reflections on that. Very interested what you have to say.
Wonderful. You see, I lived in the Middle East for a number of years, and I have wonderful brothers and sisters in the Orthodox Christian Church. And I love Jordan Peterson, for example, is embraced very highly and looked upon with high regard from the Orthodox Christians. And they have the belief in the mysticism of God. God is God and humans are humans. I think that some of the mistakes of the Protestants is that sometimes they want to be God. We want to say who is good or who is not good, and you know, we want to address the issue of Hindus, although we've never even been to India, have we? We want to speak about the millions in China and what will become of them, as though we are God. And I do believe in the segment of humility. I believe that we should all look upon ourselves as the least. We should wash each other's feet, like it's also written in the Bible, or as Jesus says. And we should allow for God to judge among all of us. And it's a problem because if I apply a just strong judgment towards others, the same scripture says that the same judgment will be applied to me. So I think with the great commandment, love others as a first and foremost and forefront commandment to all of us, I think this is where our focus should be, in humility, pertaining to to theology and Christian theology. We have Saint Paul. He also says that God has many ways of approaching us in the kingdom. There are many rooms, says Jesus. And Paul explains carefully, I do believe it is in the book of Romans, how some will be judged according to their conscience. And many Protestants would argue and say, no, no Hindus will go to God because they don't believe in Jesus. Well, the question is, how would they even know about Jesus? They live in India, and, you know, of course, there's many Christians in India, I'm not saying, but I mean, you cannot condemn somebody who hasn't understood the message. And the message is a variety of messages. And Paul says that some will be judged from the sense of their conscience. Others will be judged in other ways. So I think we can leave all of that up to God. And sometimes, to be honest, I think too that there's a self-contentment in the way Christians go about speaking about Jesus, as if, you know, some say, the Protestant, I met Jesus in 1954. And since then, the person is like always on the way to heaven. And it doesn't even count however he treats other people. If he meets a Hindu, how does he treat that Hindu gentleman? I have met many Hindus and they are very humble. I have met many Muslims, they are very humble. I look upon mankind as my brothers and sisters, and I would not go into that kind of rhetoric of saying who will end up here or there. I should watch it myself so I don't end up in the wrong place. And I think precisely that kind of attitude of respect of diversity and knowledge that we are all born, or we are all created in the image of God, all of us, that should join us all in a wonderful fellowship in which we should try to understand each other and love one another, rather than categorize one another and according to skin color, which is so fashionable today, and all of that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, as a Hindu, it's pretty easy for us. You see, I really do think it for the Abrahamic religions, it becomes problematic because of the idea that there's one you know, chosen people from the Jews, and then, you know, one book or whatever, or one. Whereas for the Hindus, yes, there's one truth, but it is revealed in so many different ways and in so many different aspects of time and place. And so in a sense, it's like the huge elephant. Right now, our human minds cannot comprehend it. Right? I mean, we know we can't hear all the sounds that an elephant can hear or a dog can hear. We can't see all the things that a bumblebee could see all this the spectrum. So we are limited in so many ways, and so, you know, if reality, which is true and objective and real, is like a huge elephant, it's like the blind man. Some people feel the tail, some people feel the trunk, some people feel just the side, some people feel the leg, and they think that's it. And this is a wall, it's a snake, it's a tree trunk. But really it's all of that in a way that we can barely put together with our limited human minds, you know. But no, I'm very interested in that because of your, you know, your wide experience and travel, but your commitment to Christianity, which I totally respect as well. And I find it so let me go on because I know we can go talking forever, but I mean, your book New Left Tyranny, right? We will have a proper discussion on the New Books Network about the book, but that certainly continues your trend and your sort of journalistic thing rather than your theological interests and your historical ones, but about what's going on in the world, the breakdown, you know. And your book, you know, is written at the time of coronavirus and now published at the time when Black Lives Matter is coming up. So talk a bit about your book for us, and also in the context of what's going on right now. And it appears every week something new is happening. We're experiencing some accelerated developments here. I'd like to hear your opinions on that in the context of your book.
Yes, and let me just comment on your previous point there, because to me personally, I just simply believe there is a creator. I simply believe that the world is, I cannot understand how such an intrinsic beauty as what we see, and such a complexity in nature, within the human body and outwardly, how it all works so finely tuned together.
And according to laws.
Man's mental state, all of this, I just cannot believe that it came out of nothing. So being an atheist for me is just simply not possible, I do believe. Going to the book, one of the issues that I do argue in the book follows the famous atheist, Jürgen Habermas. He's an old man now, but he was one of those who post-World War II argued that we needed a strong secular state and secularism in Europe that really placed religious values and, you know, reasons to disagree, such as within the different segments of religion, you know, a bit in the private sphere, so that the secular Europe could be developed. Now he changed his mind a number of years later, because he said that precisely the religious values, and in this context, the Christian values, had the ability to motivate individuals to do good, to be empathetic, to show solidarity with the weak. And we know that in the European context, both the welfare state was initially formed by Christian preachers who in empathy saw the problems among the poor and the working class and began working to relieve their pain by strengthening state structures in such a way that there could be the benefits of a welfare system, for example. Pertaining to Black slavery, we see that it is actually, we have an article on that just now up front at the Herland report. It was actually the British Empire and the Christian preachers who started the abolishing movement that wanted to abolish slavery, and they accomplished that. So there seems to be an element of empathy that you do find with people that revere and have a spiritual connection.
And I want
And
to
this,
add something. A lot of the contemporary atheists, even people like what they call the new atheists, like Dawkins or Hitchens, right? What I find very intriguing with them is that they are actually proceeding from a Christian morality. They don't like God because they think God is too mean, or God is too evil, or God is not loving enough. So that comes from a particularly Christian upbringing, that then they are finding that their understanding of what God is doesn't actually match up to the loving creature that they expect. But that is a very, very specific Christian ethics. So these atheists are actually saying they don't like God because he's not Christian enough, and they are in fact more Christian than God. So they and it is a very interesting thing. They don't understand the cultural context, because like in Nietzsche or de Sade, if you looked at the atheists of the 16th century or 17th century or 18th century, they realize, when they realize that if there's no God, then you can murder people, you can kill people, you can be that is because there's no God, right? Whereas this Dawkins, Hitchens, these kind of Sam Harris, these kind of atheists would be horrified at murder and lying and cheating and stealing, because ultimately they are informed by Christian ethics. I just wanted to put that out to you.
that is so true. And pertaining to the traditional, let's say, cultural values versus the neo-Marxist radical Karl Marx, religion is opium to the people, and all of that. Although I would argue that opium is really something that the liberals love so much. We haven't had a drug culture the way we do today since when they came to power. So obviously they love opium. It's just that they don't love religion. But I mean, wouldn't it be more healthy to, pray some prayers and get some spiritual peace rather than living off opium and the $1 billion, $100 billion annual, coming into the United States, for example. I mean, crack and opioids and all of these epidemics. But that set aside, okay, they attack the traditional values, but I think there's somewhat a mistake in that. And coming back to Habermas, that's what he's been saying, that look, we do need the Christian ethic. We do need, there seems to be something that happens in an individual if he sits down and prays, if he becomes a bit, if he, wants to be humble, if he wants to meet his fellow man from an angle of respect rather than authoritarianism. We tend to see less murders. Look, the 1900s were the age of the atheists and we see, from Pol Pot to Stalin to Hitler to all of those, we've seen far more people killed in the atheist world or sentiment than we've seen among religions. And I have a good a Muslim friend, and she always used to tell me before, I'll be very careful to marry a man who really is a good Muslim and does his prayers. If I would marry an atheist, God knows what he would do to me, because he doesn't believe in Judgment Day. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of that fear of the judgment over my life, or as a religious person, basically disregarding whichever religion you come from. You can be a Buddhist, it's the same thing. You don't reach nirvana if you behave in a certain way, or if you don't take heed of respecting others. So it's a generalized sentiment among all religions. It could be argued that the fear of the judgment after death, or the fear as among you Hindus, you know, of being regenerated into something that wouldn't be that nice. You know, that sense of judgment keeps you tiptoed, careful how you live and how you treat others. So I think one of the elements among the anarchist neo-Marxist movement that came in the 60s, and this is what I address in the new Left Tyranny, I do say it did become a tyranny, didn't it? And okay, the book is now out, and as the book comes out, we see the whole tyranny on display, where millennials, white millennials, Antifa white millennials with all their tattoos, clad in, I don't know, looking like terrorists, go around smashing Black Americans' shops and then writing Black Lives Matter on top of, or spraying Black Lives Matter all around. You know, I mean, what is this? It's an idea of that society, once we break everything down, everything will be wonderful. Maybe we return to what you started off saying, to those of us who have lived in countries that are not that easy to live in. For example, military dictatorships. We have seen how horrible things can get if you don't take heed to keep the stability. But the young ones today, they haven't seen that. So maybe they want their Marxist period and the tearing down of all rules and all regulations. It does look like that. But again, I do think that will benefit Trump. If nothing unforeseen happens in America, I do think that very many more Americans are going to vote for law and order Trump rather than defund the police and get raped like we now see in Minneapolis.
But I have to say, I'm very disappointed with Trump, the way he's let this thing go, because I think that he's been trying to pander to the Black Lives Matter movement, and you know, he should have been more law and order, as he said. I mean, when you had the White House, the protests around the White House. You know, he let that go for a long time, but then when he finally called out I can't remember if it was the National Guard or whoever it was, the military, whatever military branch it was, within an hour the crowd dispersed. And they could have done that, I think, in many places, but it's as if he allowed. It's just like when Barack Obama was there, and well, it was his policy to let them vent, destroy property and whatnot. And so this has become sort of the norm. They just give them space to burn down buildings and destroy cars and homes. And it just and I can't believe that Trump has done this and allowed all this destruction to happen and the tearing down of the statues all over by mobs. I really have lost a lot of respect for him during this crisis. I don't know how you feel.
I would like to argue, I was in the United States last year discussing with a number of politicians, CIA directors, NSA people, senators, you know, like I was saying, authors, also Black Lives Matter leaders, and the community leaders, socialists and all. And I must say that and I would like to say to Judicial Watch directors, we have a recent show with one of the Judicial Watch directors in which he explains too that the problem in the United States is that they're bordering on civil war, in the sense that Trump doesn't have the power. He has a certain amount of power, but we have seen now the past month with all these riots, he has wanted to place in National Guard, but the Pentagon told him, no, you are not doing that. So we are seeing a nation in which the chief commander of the army does not command the army. Yeah. We saw that in Syria, for example. It's a very serious situation, and this is, of course, why everyone in the world are following it very carefully to try to avoid a big-time war over this. But we saw it in Syria. when Trump came to power, he said that I'm going to withdraw the troops, and he pledged the decree to remove the American troops from Syria, and nobody moved.
Yeah.
So it was clear from that. I think 3 times he has commanded the army to leave Syria, and 3 times the army has not moved. So
right.
the army doesn't obey him. So this is what they in the United States, of course, call the deep state. They say they are in a state of a coup d'etat, in which there are forces within the State Department and the FBI collaborating with, this is what they're saying, the Obama administration, that there was a collusion at that time, and that has been growing and growing, and that they are very displeased with Trump wanting to get the jobs back to America, Trump wanting to stop the globalist system that is enriching the 0.001% in America. One has to go back to 1987 in the United States to find the high point for the middle class. We've seen the robbing of the lower classes to the point that today I think around 30 individuals in the United States own more than, or no, in the world own more than 50% of world assets. So they do not want to have their work disrupted, and Trump has to juggle between what he wants to do and what he is able in real life to do, because he has to take into consideration that he is the president, but he does not command every single element. So I would assume, I haven't spoken to people in the US who are close to him about that, because I haven't even had the need to do it. I assume that he would have wanted to send the National Guard long time ago, but the Pentagon stopped him. And there are forces within the Democratic Party that want this disruption. The Black Lives Matter came out, I think, just a few days ago, one of their leaders saying that all along our agenda has been to remove Trump. The funding of the Black Lives Matter, when you pay to the Black Lives Matter to help Black lives, it goes straight into I think it's called Act Blue. It's funding for the Democratic Party, and it has funded hundreds of millions to white rich Americans running for president in the United States. So does Black Lives Matter even have an agenda of helping Black lives? I don't know. And I think that the Democrats, looking at the way they kneel and everything, I mean, remember, the Democrats were the KKK. They were the ones that wanted to keep slavery.
Yeah.
And they are being very denigrating towards Black people. I find, in my personal opinion, saying you're Black, so you have to vote for me.
Yeah.
You have to vote Democrat because you're Black. What is that kind of rhetoric? So I think there are forces in the US that want to divide the US and want to create a worse situation, and that Trump is somehow stuck a little bit in between. He's doing what he can, but he does not have the full power over that nation.
Yeah. It's a real, it's a historic moment we're witnessing. I mean, who would have thought in our lifetime that we would have seen this kind of attack and explosion and disruption, because you have the economic collapse, so with the 60s and in 68, 67 we had a lot of similar things going on. It wasn't with the same type of historic Great Depression collapse and the coronavirus thing, and we are really living through a time that's, I think, going to define the next few decades, I think, in terms of even the whole, I mean, you on your site have, said the right and left distinction is meaningless, it doesn't help, and I've came to that conclusion as well for some decades now, and now we see it more than ever, I think. I mean, it's very interesting that even, say with the coronavirus lockdown, the people who were most vociferous for fighting for their freedom are the religious people, right? The atheists the ones who say trust the science are really the authoritarians, are really the ones who are the submissive, who are the controlled, who will listen to whatever the scientists tell them in the media, you know, and so it's a really interesting dynamic. Things are shaking up, and I think alignments are going to be very different. How do you see it?
No, I do, like I said previously, I do see that the authoritarian element within the left is very, very obvious now. It's sad for the left because, look, socialism, any ism, has a lot of good in it. I mean, you know, socialists and very many socialists were religious people and still are. So it's not a question of conservative, then you are religious, versus socialist, then you are not. That is not a correct perception as well. Again, things are very complex. I mean, the socialists were the ones that wanted to take care of the weak in society, and how Christian isn't that, you know? And there's been elements of solidarity, which was a socialist word. I mean, it's a wonderful word. But I do think that the development we've seen since the emergence of globalism, let's date it to around mid 1980s. Some of the large corporations in the United States had outgrown the United States, and they were looking for larger, you know, markets to enter and to expand in. And from that moment on came that idea of globalism, the reduction of, you know, we weren't supposed to have borders anymore. Everybody were supposed to move around freely. The large corporations didn't tax to any specific nation, which has been one of Trump's issues. He says, I want them to start taxing to the United States. In Europe, we've seen these large corporations, they eradicate, for example, local shops, because local shops have to tax, they tax to a nation, but these guys come in or wherever, and they just assemble all the wealth into their own hands. So some of that borderlessness has a very strong economic sense to it. And the socialists, I do believe personally, have been bought up in the United States, because there's something about a very strong state. If you have we saw it in the Soviet Union, a very strong state means that just a very few men will rule us all. And we saw it with the National Socialism in Germany. People tend to forget about that. I write about that in the new Left Tyranny as well. It was a National Socialist state. People forget that. They say that the Nazi system was right-wing, but it was really basically left-wing. And the authoritarianism coming out of that system was extremely left-wing, and groupthink and a strong state, and everybody had to say behave and have exactly the same opinion. So it's been around for a long time that there are elites that want to control a socialist state. And I think that the smart, rich people in the United States have understood that if they vote socialist, and if they merge and fund the socialists coming into power in the House of Congress and whatnot, fund their running for Congress, and so many of them now are funded by these precise, very strong capitalist groups, then there's a possibility for the capital owners also through a strong state to access taxpayers' money. And this was the system that made the East Indian Company so successful back in the British Empire. That the money within the East Indian Company accessed taxpayers' money, so that whatever you and I pay in tax actually ends up in the pockets and being distributed precisely by the richest men in the world through the merging of the NGOs with the private capital. So this is the whole system that, of course, Trump has announced that he is attempting to fight. And it is this system that is fighting him back now. So we live in interesting times, and we'll have to just see what will happen here. But I think the erosion of the middle class in the United States and the desperate situation for the working class and for the black, uneducated black Americans as well, of course, as well as uneducated working class white Americans and whatever other skin color there is over there. The situation really is a class struggle.
Yeah.
And there we are back to Karl Marx.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a complexity here. And this is much of what I also discuss in the new Left Tyranny, available on Amazon.
Excellent, excellent. Now, I've kept you long enough, so we can try to wrap up, but we will continue this, as I said, especially speaking on your book for the New Books Network. But in trying to wrap up and bring it to a close, it's been a very interesting conversation, and there's so many points I want to continue talking about, which we will do later. But in sum, what would you say the main messages that you want to put out to the world? Because your life has a you have a life work, and I believe you have a life message. How would you sum it?
I would argue that we need to attempt to get justice for a variety of different groups in society. I think stability in society, and to have growth and respect, and to have people get lives that are accomplished and makes them happy. If we want to create that kind of a society, we need to have respect for differences. We need to fight for the groups that are being bullied and that are being demonized. And I think that tyranny or dictatorships, in the sense that only one opinion is allowed, is the enemy of humankind, because we have many different opinions, and precisely the ability to discuss in humility amongst one another, and with a certain respect for both God and the love for humanity. We need to respect the differences, and we cannot pick just one color of skin and say that is the only color that matters. But we need to have that variety and that plurality, and that has been since I am not particularly afraid. I mean, I'm born and raised in a dictatorship in the Congo, and I've always stood up, for some reason, on my 2 feet and been independent. I've always seen how propaganda ends up pushing people to a groupthink way of doing things that ends up demonizing particular groups. And that is something that I have always spoken up and stood and defended. Sometimes also groups that I don't agree with at all, but I have defended their right to be minorities in the complex majority. And I think that goes for the global system as well. I do believe we need to re-implement a stronger respect for the nation state. Mm-hmm. I do believe that those who live in a nation are the ones that should be able to decide which values should be in that particular nation. And we others should respect that people own the wealth in their own nations. And then they can, have a good nation or a bad nation, have corrupt leaders or non-corrupt leaders. But it is, after all, their right to determine and to own their own country. So I think a stronger implementation of national sovereignty also will help our politicians not to be so focused on Bill Gates and George Soros and all the big hotshots with all the money. Maybe they will start to take care of the little man in their own nations and start to care for the population again and for the well-being of the population. And remember that they were elected to take care of the people that live in that nation state, not to help Bill Gates get even richer. So that, I would say, maybe is the sum of what I think the debate should be around. And first and foremost, to respect one another and to respect one another's right to differ of opinion.
Great. And when I interview people like yourself who are have a mission, who have gone through struggle and challenges, I always like to just ask you, if in summary, because I know it can be challenging, but whenever whenever we face challenges, whenever we face temporary defeats that might look permanent, whenever we face obstacles, there's something that each one of us has that makes us move forward, push on. What is that for you? What has that been for you?
I would probably go back to the fundament of my life, which is my belief in God. And I do think that from this belief that God wants us to live in this Eden, the world is an Eden that he created for us. And he placed in that Eden man with his free will. And I do think that we need to apply that free will in order to do good. And that may be the sum of some of what I strongly do believe in. So it's with the Jews, the Jewish culture. A rich guy in Israel once told me, he said, with the Jewish culture, it works like this. We believe that God created the world, but it is not perfect here. So it is the job of man to try to make the world a better place.
Yeah. Now, what would you, for any young people listening, you have any recommendations for them who they're facing a confusing world. They might not even be able to envisage a type of future, but what advice would you give to young people listening right now?
First of all, I would advise them to follow Jordan Peterson. I would advise them to read his book, The 12 Rules for Life, because he has a great deal of wisdom pertaining to how we can face a problematic situation. How can we remain on top? How can we remain happy? How can we find a mental state that will help us overcome the problems in life? And I would also recommend them to stay open. Don't close your head and say that you understand and you know everything, but open your mind and read history. When you meet with other people, do it from a humble state, acknowledging that you do not know everything, but that there's a lot for you to learn. And from such a perspective of humility and kindness towards others, I would say that all of this is summed up by the one rule or the one ideal that maybe all the religions, but at least Christianity brings forth, and that is love one another. We are brothers and sisters here in this world, and we are to attempt all we can. It's not always easy, but we are to attempt and have it as a goal to be kind to one another, to be just to one another. And I think if young people apply themselves to that, I think we will find solutions both for the difficult political situations we are in, and also for the world in general, regardless of whichever nation you do live in. And finally, don't forget to be kind to your grandmother. Always take care of the elderly and speak to them and ask them about how it was to live during World War II and the difficulties they had. Maybe your grandmother can give you a tip or two that will help you stay healthy and happy in your life, even in troubled times.
Absolutely. I know you've just published your new Left Tyranny book, and it's available on Amazon. We'll have the link in the description below. But you have any? And you told us about the Viking series you have coming up. I look forward to that. Any other plans you'd like to, or projects that you're working on? I know the Herland report is ongoing, and you're constantly adding things. Any other things you want the listeners and viewers to know about coming up?
Actually, I'm quite far into writing another book. I'm really productive nowadays, so there's gonna be some interesting books coming up from my part as well. So that's for one, and we're strongly developing also the website to bring more encouraging elements in which we discuss historic phases, in history, what has happened in history before us, because we see that there's so many negative news now, and we think that will continue. We will go through very hard times coming up. So those are some of the elements that we're doing, and we do have eventually. At the moment, we're pausing some of the shows, and we're not. I mean, it's impossible to travel to the United States and everything. We might be moving on to a Zoom function. I don't know, but we still have very many programs that are ready to be launched from the YouTube channel as well, with leading Americans. So there's much interesting stuff and many very exciting people coming on to the Herland Report YouTube as well, coming forward.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, you're doing amazing work. You're very productive, very prolific. I love to see that. And so listeners and viewers, I'll put the links below, but they can check you out at hannenabintuherland.com, correct?
They can also go theherlandreport.com.
Okay.
That accesses the same website, Herland Report, and you can Google Herland Report. And you will also find theherlandreport.com. That's where we have all the information, and on YouTube as well.
Yeah, and you have your newsletter, and it's updated very regularly. I recommend it highly recommend it to everybody. So I want to thank you not only for this interview, but really for all your work, your insight, your determination, your intelligence, your vision. What you're doing is extremely important.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
I wish you and the Herland Report greater and greater success, and every success in your mission. Thanks for being a leading, brave voice. So that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, and like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.